Welcome to Conversations Live. For more than a decade, we've brought you the best in books, entertainment, celebrity interviews, and current events. When the movers and shakers of the world have something to say to you, they say it to us first. Here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
Welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all can join us once again. But for our radio audience here in Mississippi at WYAD 94.1 FM and WYADonline.com, we're glad that you all could be with us. Also joining us through our friends at iHeartRadio and Amazon Music Podcast. We're glad you all could be with us as well. It's hard to believe we just commemorated 21 years since the attacks of 9/11, 2001. And as we are reflecting back on that time, there's still so many things that stand out, so many memories. One of the things that happened after 9/11 was the ANTHRAX attacks, and that's why we're really excited to talk to our next guest. We're excited to welcome Oscar-nominated director Dan Krauss to our program to talk about his new project that's now on Netflix. It's called The ANTHRAX Attacks, In the Shadow of 9/11. We'll talk to Dan not only about what it was like for him to chronicle that time that was so full of fear and conspiracy, but also what it's been like for him to see the response as well. Dan, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So, Dan, it was interesting for me prepping for this segment because the reviews, of course, are already coming in for the ANTHRAX attacks and the way that people are, for one, taken back to that time for those of us who were alive, but also in the mayhem, the chaos that kind of surrounded that time. What has it been like for you, Dan, to see the response to the ANTHRAX attacks so far?
It is interesting. I think the most common response I get is that people have forgotten completely that this even happened, and also that it was an attack from within and not the work of foreign terrorists. I think a lot of people who lived through that time, myself included, had filed the anthrax attacks under the general heading of foreign terrorism. And it's only looking back and re-examining that time that you remember that this was a domestic attack, according to the FBI, and not the act of foreign terrorism. So it's been sort of a fascinating experience to go back to a time that I remember as just a blur of chaos and fear, and sort of pick it apart and remember all the details that I had forgotten about just what a strange time it was.
And I think, too, again, and it's so interesting to hear you say that, Dan, because it's interesting, too, as I was talking to some people about my speaking with you, some of them had forgotten, even though they were alive at the time, had forgotten about, the anthrax attacks that were going on and what was being thought of at the time, and then, of course, what kind of unfolded. Was that kind of the why for you in wanting to do this documentary?
It was a big part of the why, yeah. I had forgotten how bizarre this story was and how expansive the investigation that followed it was as well. I mean, it was a 7-year journey to determine who was responsible for these attacks and the largest investigation in FBI's history. So there was a lot there that was left unpacked, and including the story of the postal workers who worked at the sorting facility that processed mail for the Capitol near Washington, D.C., who were affected by these attacks as well. Their story had been almost completely unreported, and we felt very fortunate that we were able to help bring that story into daylight. And that was another, aspect of that time that had, I think largely been forgotten. And so it was fascinating to go back and talk to those folks and realize that 21 years later, they're still deeply affected by what happened to them a long time ago.
Of course. The other thing that comes up in your documentary, Dan, and again, congratulations to you on it, and you can tell the time that went into it. But one thing that struck me that is very timely for 2022 is the weaponizing of fear and paranoia and distrust. And we see that so present today. What was that like for you to think of that irony, that even though this was 21 years ago, I mean, the same motivation in many ways is still impacting us today?
Yeah, there are a lot of echoes, from 21 years ago that we can feel resonating still today, and certainly one of them is this kind of idea that, first of all, the idea that there can be a airborne pathogen that you can inhale and potentially die because of is something that we're acutely aware of today, and so there's that kind of obvious echo with history, but also the idea that, as you suggested, that there was a sort of cynical use of these anthrax attacks to on the part of politicians, especially to campaign for the war on terror, even after it was clear that the most likely source of this anthrax was from U.S. government laboratories. There was this kind of drumbeat to the wars overseas that was in part justified by the fear that was stoked by the anthrax attacks.
Right. And I think, too, the connection so many people made, again, with the events of 9/11, 2001, and then, of course, the anthrax attacks coming so soon after. So for you, I mean, this is you've been able to find success, Dan, with your other work as well. We're in a time that where streaming is taking such a big part of our lives, giving so many people an opportunity to be able to watch projects like the anthrax attacks. What has that been like for you to have it on Netflix now, to be able to be streamed and people to have these discussions like we're having?
Well, it's incredible. I mean, what's an immense privilege for a filmmaker in this day and age is to have your work seen globally. And that's something that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, a movie like this could be seen perhaps on a cable channel or have a small theatrical run, but when it goes on a service like Netflix, it's literally instantly live everywhere across the entire planet. And that is, you feel, of course, the responsibility that comes along with that. You need to get the story right, and you need to make it a story that people can relate to no matter where they live. And so you have to find the universality in the story that will resonate across borders. And that's one of the challenges of these kinds of stories, of course, regardless of who sees them. But the burden is especially great when you know it's going to be seen across the globe. What can everyone see in the story that's a part of them or their experience?
Love that. Last question for you, Dan. We're going to remind our audience how they can watch it. You as the filmmaker, did you have something you hope kind of stayed with the viewer afterwards? What was part of your thing that you hoped after the people actually watched it that they would remember or take away from it?
Well, one of the things that was really important to the entire filmmaking team and to me as part of that team was the story of the postal workers that I referenced earlier, who showed such tremendous courage, dignity, and heart in the face of just incredibly challenging circumstances. These are folks who had been asked to stay inside the postal facility plant even though they were aware that anthrax may have passed through their building, and did so because they were asked to, and paid the price. And two workers died, and many more were sickened. And I took a lot of courage from hearing their stories, and I think viewers will as well. They're just tremendously inspiring people, and I felt privileged to be able to include them in our film.
Yeah. We can definitely be able to see that and so much more in this. Again, everyone, the Anthrax Attacks in the Shadow of 9/11 is available now for streaming on Netflix. Our guest, again, has been Oscar-nominated director Dan Krauss. Dan, thank you so much again for the time. Really appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Conversations Live. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb, saying as always, enjoy your day, enjoy your life, enjoy your world. Thank you all for choosing Conversations Live. Now let's go make today amazing. Take care.